In 1923, Germany experienced one of history's most severe currency collapses. People burned money for heat because it had become cheaper than firewood. A cup of coffee could double in price during the time it took to drink it. Workers received wages twice daily because morning pay lost significant purchasing power by afternoon. This occurred in Germany, one of Europe's most industrialized economies at the time. The central bankers managing this crisis were highly educated economists who believed their monetary policies were fundamentally sound and different from previous currency failures. What's particularly relevant for Americans today is examining how similar policy decisions by our Federal Reserve compare to the sequence of events in Weimar Germany. Both involved printing money to address debt crises, both initially dismissed rising inflation, and both continued expansionary policies despite mounting price pressures. The underlying economic relationships that drove Germany's currency crisis remain unchanged. Understanding these patterns offers valuable insights into current monetary policy risks. By November 1923, one US dollar exchanged for 4.2 trillion German marks. This represents a devaluation from the pre-war rate of 4.2 marks per dollar in 1914. Essentially, a trillion-fold loss of purchasing power within a decade. Consider a practical example from that period. A student ordering coffee in Berlin would pay 5,000 marks. After sitting for 20 minutes, a second cup would cost 7,000 marks. This wasn't unusual. Prices changed multiple times throughout each day as the currency's value declined in real time. The price inflation was severe. Bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 reached 200 billion marks by November, an increase of 800 million times within 10 months. German employers adapted by paying workers twice daily, as wages lost substantial purchasing power between morning and afternoon. Restaurants abandoned printed menus because prices required constant updates throughout each day. Urban scenes reflected the currency's dysfunction. Citizens transported cash in wheelbarrows for basic purchases. Families weighed money rather than counting it due to the volume of notes required for transactions. The abundance of worthless currency led to unconventional uses. People discovered that burning banknotes provided more heating value than the fuel those notes could purchase. Germany's financial system was running 300 paper mills and over 2,000 printing presses around the clock, 7 days a week, just to produce enough physical currency to keep up with demand. The Reichsbank was literally printing money faster than any economy in human history. Their printing operations consumed entire forests just to create the paper needed for all these worthless bills. Printing companies hired workers in 3 shifts because the machines never stopped running. But what caused this monetary apocalypse? The story starts in 1918 when Germany surrendered after World War I. The country owed 156 billion marks in war debt, already a staggering sum that represented multiple years of the entire German economy's output. Then came the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which added 50 billion marks in reparations payments to the Allied powers. Think of it as the world's most expensive credit card bill, with no way to pay it off and the interest compounding daily. By 1921, German politicians faced an impossible choice. They could raise taxes to astronomical levels, which would destroy what remained of their economy and likely trigger revolution. Or they could have their central bank, the Reichsbank, simply create the money needed to make payments. The political class chose the path of least resistance, the printing press. In August 1921, the Reichsbank began what they euphemistically called temporary assistance to the government. They started buying foreign currency with freshly printed German marks to make reparation payments to France and Britain. This was the moment the death spiral began, though hardly anyone recognized it at the time. Reichsbank President Rudolf Havenstein insisted this was a short-term emergency measure that would end once the reparations crisis passed. Watch what happened to the exchange rate once this temporary policy began. In mid-1922, $1 bought 320 marks. German officials insisted this was manageable and temporary. The Reichsbank published reassuring statements about returning to monetary normalcy. By December 1922, that same dollar bought 7,400 marks. The currency was already collapsing, but the Reichsbank kept printing, insisting they were preventing an even worse economic crisis. Then came 1923, and everything accelerated beyond anyone's comprehension. The French and Belgian armies invaded the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland, because Germany had fallen behind on reparation payments. The German government's response? They declared passive resistance and printed money to pay striking workers while simultaneously buying coal from abroad to replace what they couldn't mine in the occupied territory. Picture the Reichsbank officials in their offices, watching their currency evaporate in real time. Every day brought fresh disasters. Every solution required printing more money. Every new bill printed made the existing money worth less. They were trapped in a feedback loop of their own creation, where each attempt to solve the crisis made the crisis worse. The human cost was devastating beyond anything modern Americans can imagine. Middle-class families watched their life savings become worthless overnight. A pension that could support someone for decades suddenly couldn't buy a single meal. Teachers, government workers, and retirees faced literal starvation, while people who owned farms or factories could still afford food by raising their prices every few hours. Elderly Germans who had worked their entire lives and saved responsibly found themselves begging for food. University professors couldn't afford to ride the streetcar to work. Doctors and lawyers traded their services for potatoes and bread because money had become meaningless. The social fabric of one of Europe's most advanced societies was disintegrating. Social order began cracking under the pressure. People hoarded anything with real value: food, tools, clothes, furniture, soap, candles. Barter systems emerged because nobody trusted money anymore. Farmers refused to sell crops for marks, demanding payment in foreign currency, gold, or manufactured goods. City dwellers organized raids into the countryside, desperate to exchange their worthless paper for anything edible. Crime exploded as desperate people stole anything they could trade for food. Political extremists from both the far left and far right gained followers among the financially ruined middle class. The economic chaos created the perfect breeding ground for radical ideologies that promised simple solutions to complex problems. Meanwhile, the Reichsbank kept insisting they were managing the crisis professionally. Their economists published papers explaining why German monetary policy was superior to other countries. They had sophisticated models, academic theories, and rational arguments for why their approach would eventually work. Havenstein gave speeches about the temporary nature of current policies and the bright future ahead once Germany navigated through this difficult period. By November 1923, the mathematical reality could no longer be ignored or explained away. The Reichsbank was printing money so fast that the physical act of printing couldn't keep pace with the numbers they needed to create. They started issuing emergency money printed on one side, only to save time. Local governments began issuing their own currencies because waiting for official money from Berlin took too long. The final collapse happened with breathtaking speed that shocked even the pessimists. In October 1923, $1 bought 25 billion marks. 3 weeks later, it bought 4.2 trillion marks. The currency didn't just lose value, it essentially ceased to exist as a store of wealth or medium of exchange. German officials had promised that their sophisticated approach to monetary policy would prevent the kind of currency collapse that had destroyed other nations throughout history. They insisted Germany was different, that their central bank was more advanced, that their economic models were superior to anything that had come before. They were catastrophically wrong, and their mistake destroyed the financial foundation of one of the world's most advanced economies, creating the chaos and resentment that would eventually bring Adolf Hitler to power 10 years later. What happened in March 2020 should have sent chills down the spine of every economist who studied Weimar Germany. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $4.2 trillion to $8.9 trillion in just 24 months. They printed $4.7 trillion. More money than existed in the entire U.S. economy just decades earlier. Think about that number for a moment. In 2 years, our central bank created more money than the combined GDP of Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. They didn't gradually increase the money supply or carefully manage inflation expectations. They opened the floodgates and printed money faster than any central bank in American history. The money supply growth tells an even more alarming story. M2, the measure economists use to track money in circulation, grew by 25% in a single year. That's the largest peacetime monetary expansion in our nation's history. For comparison, during the 2008 financial crisis, the money supply grew by just 10% over 2 years, and that was considered unprecedented at the time. But America wasn't alone in this monetary madness. The European Central Bank's balance sheet reached 8.8 trillion euros, doubling since 2015. The Bank of Japan kept printing to support government spending on stimulus programs. The Bank of England expanded its balance sheet by 50% in 18 months. Central banks across the developed world were all following the same playbook simultaneously, coordinating the largest monetary expansion in human history. And just like in Weimar Germany, the results were entirely predictable to anyone who understood monetary history. U.S. inflation hit 9.1% in June 2022, the highest in 40 years. European inflation reached 10.6% in October 2022. Countries that printed the most money experienced the highest inflation. The correlation was perfect and immediate, just like it was in the 1920s Germany. Here's where the Weimar parallel becomes impossible to ignore. Both crises followed the exact same sequence of events, like a financial playbook being executed step by step across different centuries. Step 1. Unsustainable debt crisis. Weimar Germany owed massive war reparations they couldn't possibly pay through normal taxation without destroying what remained of their post-war economy. In 2020, we faced COVID spending that exploded our national debt while tax revenues collapsed due to lockdowns. Different crisis, same mathematical impossibility of paying without destroying the economy. Step 2. Central bank monetization of government debt. Instead of raising taxes dramatically or cutting spending severely, both governments chose the politically easier path of monetary financing. The Reichsbank bought government bonds with freshly printed marks to fund reparation payments. The Federal Reserve bought government bonds with freshly printed dollars to fund stimulus spending. Same mechanism, same political calculation, same economic consequences. Step 3. Inflation dismissed as temporary phenomenon. Reichsbank officials insisted their money printing was just a temporary measure to handle the reparations crisis and would end once political tensions eased. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell spent most of 2021 calling inflation transitory while printing $120 billion every single month to buy government and corporate bonds. Both central banks told their populations not to worry while they systematically destroyed their currency's purchasing power. Step 4. Accelerating money creation to cover widening deficits. As debt payments grew larger and economic problems multiplied, both central banks printed even faster to keep up. The Reichsbank couldn't stop because reparations kept coming due and the government had no other funding source. The Federal Reserve couldn't stop because government spending never decreased and bond markets demanded someone buy all that newly issued debt. Step 5. Currency devaluation creates self-reinforcing spiral. As more money chased the same goods and services, prices rose, which meant even more money was needed to buy the same things. Both currencies entered a feedback loop where printing money to solve the original debt problem created an inflation problem that required even more money printing to maintain government funding. The "see, it's just temporary" lie is perhaps the most chilling parallel between these two eras. In 1922, Reichsbank President Rudolf Havenstein repeatedly insisted that monetary expansion was purely a temporary measure to handle reparation payments. He promised the German people that once the international crisis passed, Germany would return to sound money principles and normal economic conditions. Sound familiar? Throughout 2021, Jerome Powell repeatedly testified to Congress that inflation was transitory and would return to the Fed's 2% target without any significant policy changes. He kept printing $120 billion monthly, while promising the American people that this was just temporary pandemic assistance that would end once economic conditions normalized. Both central bankers waited far too long to acknowledge reality. By the time they recognized inflation was becoming self-reinforcing and embedded in expectations, the damage was irreversible. Havenstein kept printing until the mark became worthless paper. Powell kept printing until inflation reached levels not seen since the 1970s and forced the most aggressive interest rate increases in decades. The global evidence from 2020 to 2022 proves that money supply growth directly drives inflation, just like it did in Weimar Germany and every other hyperinflation in history. Countries with the highest money growth in 2020 experienced the highest inflation in 2021 to 2022. The correlation was nearly 1-to-1 across different economic systems and geographic regions. Argentina printed massive amounts of pesos and got over 50% inflation. Turkey printed massive amounts of lira and got over 80% inflation. Lebanon's currency collapsed entirely. Countries that restrained money growth, like Switzerland and Singapore, avoided the worst inflation. The pattern held across every continent and every type of economic system. This isn't a coincidence or bad luck or unique circumstances. It's the same mathematical relationship that destroyed Germany's currency a century ago and has destroyed dozens of currencies throughout history. When you create money faster than you create goods and services, prices rise. When you create money to finance government spending instead of raising taxes, you transfer wealth from savers to borrowers. When you insist this process is temporary while continuing it for years, you lose credibility, and inflation expectations spiral out of control. Yet modern central bankers made the exact same promises as their Weimar predecessors. They insisted their sophisticated economic models and policy tools made this time fundamentally different. They claimed their understanding of inflation dynamics was superior to previous generations of economists. They promised they could unwind their massive monetary expansion without significant economic consequences. The Bank for International Settlements, essentially the central bank for central banks, warned in 2021 that coordinated global money printing was recreating conditions similar to the 1970s inflation crisis. They pointed out that debt levels were higher than ever before, while central banks had exhausted their traditional policy tools and were relying entirely on money creation. Their warnings were systematically ignored. Central bankers around the world insisted they had learned from history and wouldn't repeat the mistakes of previous generations. They had inflation-targeting frameworks, forward guidance policies, sophisticated econometric models, and real-time data that previous central banks lacked. But the fundamental math hadn't changed since Weimar Germany or any other currency collapse in history. Creating money to finance government spending transfers, purchasing power from the private sector to the government. Expanding the money supply faster than economic growth creates inflation. Promising that temporary policies will end while extending them indefinitely destroys central bank credibility and anchors inflation expectations at higher levels. By late 2022, central banks around the world faced the same impossible choice that confronted the Reichsbank in 1923. They could stop printing money and watch debt markets collapse as interest rates rose to levels that made government borrowing unaffordable. Or they could keep printing money and watch inflation destroy their currency's purchasing power and social stability. Here's the terrifying reality our central bankers don't want you to understand. They're trapped in exactly the same debt prison that destroyed Weimar Germany. The numbers are so astronomically large that there's no politically acceptable way out, and every option leads to financial catastrophe. Our national debt just hit $36 trillion and climbing. At current interest rates around 5.5%, we're paying roughly $2 trillion annually just in interest payments. That's more than we spend on national defense, more than we spend on Medicare, more than the entire GDP of most countries. We're paying more money to service our existing debt than most nations produce in goods and services. But it gets exponentially worse. The Congressional Budget Office projects that debt service will consume 40% of all federal revenues within a decade if current trends continue. Think about that mathematical reality. Nearly half of every tax dollar collected will go just to paying interest on money we've already spent. That leaves barely enough to fund basic government operations, let alone new spending on infrastructure, defense, or social programs. The Eurozone faces identical mathematical impossibilities. Average debt to GDP ratios are pushing 90%, with countries like Italy and Greece well above 130%. France just crossed 110% debt to GDP. Japan's debt has reached 264% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. These aren't just big numbers. They're mathematical impossibilities that require constant refinancing at whatever interest rates bond markets demand. This is exactly the same debt trap that caught Weimar Germany and destroyed their currency. Their reparation payments were 50 billion marks on top of 156 billion marks in existing war debt. The combined obligation was mathematically unpayable through normal taxation without destroying what remained of their post-war economy. So they chose the printing press instead, and we know how that ended. Our central bankers face the identical impossible choice today, with even larger numbers and even fewer options. Option 1. Stop printing money and let interest rates rise to market-determined levels. But higher rates would make our debt service completely unaffordable and crash the economy into a depression that would make 2008 look like a minor recession. Option 2. Resume massive money printing to buy government bonds and keep interest rates artificially suppressed. But this would bring back the inflation that we supposedly defeated in 2022 to 2023, potentially leading to the same currency collapse that destroyed Germany and dozens of other countries throughout history. There's no option 3. There's no magical policy tool that makes $36 trillion in debt disappear without devastating consequences. There's no sophisticated economic model that changes the fundamental mathematics of compound interest and exponential debt growth. Yet our officials keep insisting that this time is different, and they can navigate this crisis without major economic disruption. They point to America's reserve currency status, our sophisticated financial markets, and our advanced understanding of monetary policy. They sound exactly like Reichsbank officials who insisted that Germany's gold-backed central bank and advanced economic expertise couldn't possibly experience the kind of hyperinflation that had destroyed backward countries. Both eras systematically removed the constraints that previously prevented excessive money creation. Weimar Germany removed the legal requirement that 1/3 of their currency be backed by gold reserves in May 1921. They used creative accounting tricks through something called the Loan Bureau to circumvent constitutional limits on government borrowing and money creation. We removed all gold backing from our currency in 1971. Then effectively abandoned inflation targeting from 2020 to 2021 when it became inconvenient. The Federal Reserve's mandate quietly shifted from maintaining price stability to supporting unlimited government spending and propping up financial markets. Same pattern of removing constraints, same predictable results, just with bigger numbers and more sophisticated justifications. But here's what should really terrify every American. We know exactly how this story ends because we've seen this movie before. The Weimar hyperinflation didn't end through clever monetary policy or gradual economic reform. It ended through complete financial collapse and currency replacement. In November 1923, Germany introduced the Rentenmark, a completely new currency backed by mortgage bonds on real estate and industrial assets. But here's the crucial detail that our economic textbooks often skip. This only worked because they completely destroyed the old currency first. Previous debts denominated in marks were effectively wiped out through hyperinflation. Creditors, savers, and bondholders lost everything. The German government didn't gradually transition to sound money principles. They didn't slowly reduce the money supply or carefully manage inflation expectations back to normal levels. They abandoned the mark entirely and started over with a new currency backed by real assets instead of government promises to pay. Who paid the devastating price for this monetary reset? Anyone holding German marks, government bonds, or fixed-income investments saw their wealth completely vaporized. Middle-class savers lost their entire life savings overnight. Pension funds became worthless paper. Government employees found their salaries couldn't buy a single meal. Insurance policies that were supposed to provide retirement security became worthless documents. Meanwhile, people who owned real assets, farms, factories, gold, foreign currency, industrial equipment, survived the transition and often emerged wealthier. They could raise their prices to match the declining currency. They had something tangible and valuable to trade when paper money became worthless. The wealth transfer from savers to asset owners was complete and irreversible. The social consequences were catastrophic and shaped the next century of German history. The middle class, which had provided political stability and democratic support, was financially destroyed and radicalized. Extremist political movements filled the vacuum left by collapsed institutions. The hyperinflation created the economic chaos, social resentment, and political instability that eventually brought Adolf Hitler to power a decade later. Today we have over $50 trillion in bonds and over $100 trillion in pension obligations, all denominated in currencies that central banks can create at will. Think about your retirement account, your savings bonds, your bank deposits, your insurance policies. All of these represent claims on dollars that the Federal Reserve can print into existence whenever politically convenient. The timing of currency collapses follows remarkably consistent patterns across different countries and historical periods. Weimar went from manageable inflation in January 1922, just 69 marks per dollar, to complete collapse 22 months later at 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. Remember that student whose coffee doubled in price while he was drinking it? That's how fast confidence can evaporate once the mathematical reality becomes undeniable. Our inflation crisis developed in almost identical time frame, returning with a vengeance in just 18 months from late 2020 to mid-2022. Central banks were forced to raise interest rates aggressively to contain inflation, but they can't keep rates high without breaking the debt markets that our entire financial system depends on for funding. They printed money to solve a debt crisis and created an inflation crisis. Now they're trapped between two financial disasters. Let interest rates stay high and watch the debt burden destroy government finances and crash the economy, or cut rates back to artificial levels and bring back inflation that could spiral into complete currency collapse. The Federal Reserve's own internal research shows they understand this impossible trap. Confidential documents from 2022 discussed what economists call the impossible trinity: the mathematical impossibility of maintaining low inflation, low interest rates, and high government spending simultaneously. You can choose any two of these goals, but not all three. The math doesn't allow it. Yet publicly, Fed officials continue to insist they can navigate this crisis without major economic disruption. They promise a soft landing where inflation falls to their 2% target, while interest rates remain low enough to support record levels of government debt. It's mathematically impossible given the debt levels and fiscal deficits, but they keep promising it anyway because the political alternatives are unacceptable. Reichsbank officials had PhDs in economics from the most prestigious German universities. They published sophisticated academic papers on monetary theory and exchange rate management. They insisted that their advanced understanding of economics made Germany immune to the currency collapses that had destroyed less sophisticated nations throughout history. By November 1923, German citizens were burning money for heat because it provided more warmth than the firewood those same bills could purchase. The most advanced monetary economists in Europe had created a currency so worthless that it provided more value as fuel than as money. Modern central bankers have printed more money in the past 4 years than the Reichsbank printed during their entire hyperinflation episode. They've created debt burdens larger than any peacetime economy has ever successfully managed without default or currency debasement. And they insist that their sophisticated econometric models and policy tools make this time fundamentally different. The pattern doesn't care about the historical era. It doesn't care about economic sophistication or central bank credibility or academic credentials. It cares about mathematics. And the mathematical relationships that destroyed Germany's currency in 1923 are working exactly the same way today, just with bigger numbers and faster computers. The only remaining question is timing. Will our currency collapse take 22 months, like Germany's final phase, or will it take longer because we're the global reserve currency and other countries are trapped in the same debt spiral? Will Americans need wheelbarrows to carry worthless dollars to the grocery store, or will we find more modern ways to transport increasingly worthless money? History suggests the answer is already written in the mathematical relationships between debt, money creation, and purchasing power. We just haven't reached the final chapter yet. But every month of continued money printing to fund unpayable debts brings us closer to the same ending that destroyed Weimar Germany and dozens of other currencies throughout history. The pattern never changes, only the names and dates are different.